I beg you, marry me before dawn. There is no other way to save me.
You do not know what you ask.
I know that I am truly lost without you.
On the night before she was to marry a man old enough to be her grandfather, Evelyn Whitmore ran through the rain, burst into a ruined village chapel, and grabbed the sleeve of the first man she saw. "Marry me," she whispered. "Tonight. Before they find me." He wore a dark guard's coat, wet from the storm, and at first glance, he looked like exactly what she needed: a strong man with no questions in his face and no family waiting to drag her home. But when his eyes settled on her, Evelyn felt a flicker of. They were not the eyes of a village guard. They were too calm, too sharp, too used to danger. "Did you just ask a stranger to marry you?" he said. "Yes." Perhaps the Earl of Vale's men too. If they found her before dawn, she would be dragged back to Whitmore House, dressed in white and handed over by breakfast to the old Earl who had bought her with forgiven debts. "And if I refuse?" the stranger asked. "Then I ask the next man I find," Evelyn said, trying not to. "But there may not be time." As if he knew what desperation looked like when it had been forced to dress itself as courage. "Who is chasing you?" "And the man they intend to sell me to." His gaze dropped to her wrist, where dark bruises still marked the place her stepfather had gripped her that afternoon after she refused for the third time to marry. "The Earl of Vale." The stranger's jaw hardened. "Explain," he said. So she did. Quickly, breathlessly, while the rain hammered the chapel roof and the lanterns outside came closer. Her father had died 3 years ago, leaving debts behind. Her mother had remarried a man who gambled more than he worked. When those debts became too large, the Earl of Vale had offered a solution. He would erase them in exchange for a young wife. Evelyn had refused. Her stepfather had answered by threatening her younger sister, Clara. If Evelyn disgraced the family or fled, Clara would be offered instead. "So I climbed out my window," Evelyn finished, swallowing hard. "I have no money, nowhere to go, and no one who can protect me. If I become another man's wife before sunrise, Vale will at least have to fight a scandal before he can touch me." The stranger looked at her for a long moment. Then he asked, "Is there a priest in this village?" "Father Alden lives behind the chapel." "Then let us not waste any more time." "You mean it? If I am to become your husband before sunrise," he said, "we had better wake the priest." Father Alden looked as though he suspected sin the moment he opened his door in his nightshirt, but after one glance at Evelyn's face and one longer glance at the man beside her, he asked only 2 questions. Was either of them already married, and did they understand the seriousness of what they were doing? Evelyn said yes and yes. The stranger gave his name simply as Adrian. No title. No family name. Nothing more. So beneath a leaking roof and broken stained glass, Evelyn Whitmore married a man she had known less than half an hour. Father Alden spoke the vows. Adrian slid a plain gold ring onto her finger, one he removed from a chain hidden beneath his shirt. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Evelyn stood in silence for a moment, staring at her hand in disbelief. She was married. Not to the Earl of Vale. Not to the man her family had sold her to. But to a stranger in a guard's coat with storm-grey eyes and a voice too calm for an ordinary man. It was the most terrifying relief of her life. Adrian did not waste time once the ceremony was done. He led her through the back of the chapel into the woods where a black horse waited among the trees. The rain had softened to a cold mist, but the wind still bit through Evelyn's cloak. "You'll ride," he said, loosening the reins. "And you? I'll walk beside you." "That's absurd. I've done worse." He lifted her into the saddle with effortless strength, then led the horse through the forest toward a small hunting lodge hidden among the pines. Only once they were safely inside, with a fire burning and the shutters barred, did Evelyn finally allow herself to breathe. The lodge was modest but comfortable. Adrian found blankets, dry clothes, and bread left in the kitchen. He offered her the bedroom and took the chair near the door without argument. "You do not have to sit guard all night," Evelyn said. "Yes, I do." She changed behind a folding screen and returned wearing a borrowed shirt and wool dressing gown that smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. Adrian sat by the hearth, elbows on his knees, staring into the flames with the alert stillness of a man who had learned never to fully sleep. He did not look like a guard. Not truly. Even in plain clothes, there was something too controlled about him. The way he moved. The way he spoke. The way he had listened in the chapel and decided in seconds whether to save her life. "You still haven't asked why I trusted you," Evelyn said softly. Adrian glanced up. "Why did you?" "Because you were the only man in that chapel who looked dangerous enough to frighten the Earl of Vale." How flattering. It made him look younger, less severe, and somehow even more dangerous because it suggested he could have been warm once before life taught him otherwise. The room fell quiet after that. Evelyn told him more than she meant to. About Clara. About her father. About the moment she realized her family would truly hand her to a monster if it meant saving themselves. Adrian listened without interruption, his expression. "You married a stranger to save yourself," he said when she finished. "And to save my sister." Evelyn woke to the smell of bread warming on the hearth and the strange memory that she was no longer Miss Whitmore, no longer the Earl's promised bride, and no longer entirely certain who the man in the next room really was. Adrian was already dressed. In daylight, he looked even less like a common guard than he had in the chapel. His coat was dark and well cut, his posture too elegant, his hands scarred but unmistakably those of a swordsman rather than a laborer. Before she could ask any questions, hoofbeats thundered outside. Adrian was moving before the first shout reached the door. "Stay behind me." One of them was her stepfather's steward. He pointed toward the house with a smug triumph. "There she is." Adrian stepped into the doorway and met them before they crossed the threshold. He moved with terrifying speed, disarming one man with a strike to the wrist, slamming another into the fence hard enough to leave him gasping in the mud, and knocking the third to the ground with a blow so clean it looked practiced rather than desperate. This was not the fighting of a village guard. This was disciplined, trained violence. Within seconds, all three men were groaning in the dirt. Adrian turned back to her, breathing hard but otherwise composed. "Get your cloak." He drove the carriage himself this time, north through roads Evelyn did not recognize. The farther they traveled, the more uneasy she became. The roads grew wider, the stone walls older. At last, wrought iron gates appeared through the mist, bearing a crest she had seen before in newspapers and invitation cards, Ashford. The carriage rolled through the gates toward a greystone manor so vast it seemed less a home than a kingdom. Servants were already hurrying down the steps before the wheels had stopped. A silver-haired butler reached the carriage first, visibly pale with relief. He bowed deeply. "Thank God. Welcome home, Your Grace." Slowly, she turned toward the man she had married less than 12 hours earlier. The man who had called himself Adrian and nothing more. The man she had thought was a poor guard. "My full name," he said quietly, "is Adrian Ashford. Duke of Ashford." She had escaped one nightmare by marrying a stranger in the dark only to discover that the stranger was not poor, not ordinary, and not safe. He was the missing Duke of Ashford, the man half the kingdom had been whispering about for months. "You lied to me," she said. Adrian did not deny it. "I withheld the truth." He dismissed the servants and led her into a private sitting room before he spoke again. "My father died 6 months ago," he said. "Officially of fever after a riding accident. Unofficially, I believe he was murdered. When I began searching through estate accounts, I found evidence that someone inside my family had been stealing from Ashford and passing information to men who wanted the title weakened. Soon after, my carriage was attacked outside London. I survived. The world was told I had disappeared. In truth, I remained hidden while I gathered proof against the man who wants me dead." "Who?" "My cousin Nathaniel Ashford." The hatred beneath Adrian's calm was enough to make Evelyn believe him instantly. "He benefits if I die," Adrian said. "He benefits more if I return with scandal attached to my name. That is why I was in that village under another identity. And that is why I could not tell you the truth in the chapel. If Vale's men had known who I was, you would have become bait before sunrise." So I am safer married to a hunted duke than I was as the bride of a monster. When this is over, Adrian said, if you wish to leave, I will arrange a legal. Enough money for you to live independently and my public protection against Vale or your family. I will not force you to remain in a marriage you entered out of necessity. It was also strangely painful, though Evelyn did not want to ask herself why until then. She asked. Until then, Ashford Manor is your home and no one touches you without answering to me. Ashford Manor was not merely grand. Servants moved around Adrian with fierce loyalty. Riders came and went at strange hours. Adrian spent his nights in the library bent over ledgers and letters, sleeping too little and trusting almost no one. Evelyn should have stayed out of it. Instead, she found herself drawn into his orbit. She brought tea to the library when she found him awake at dawn. She bandaged a wound in his shoulder after he reopened it during a ride and scolded him for treating his own body like an inconvenience. Adrian, who seemed unaccustomed to being scolded by anyone, obeyed with reluctant amusement. You still speak to me as though I were the guard from the chapel, he said while she tied the bandage. Would you prefer I faint because you own half the county? The threat outside sharpened soon after. Earl Vale sent a formal complaint claiming Evelyn had been abducted and unlawfully married under coercion. Her stepfather signed a statement supporting him. By evening, gossip was already spreading: the runaway bride, the missing duke, the midnight marriage. Then a stone came through Evelyn's bedroom window with a note tied around it. Return what does not belong to him, or the duke dies because of her. I am tired of being carried from one cage to another by men who think fear gives them the right to arrange my life. You are in danger because of me. Then he said quietly, if Vale or Nathaniel lays a hand on you, I will ruin them. Instead, they lodged somewhere deep in her chest and stayed there. The next afternoon, the threat turned real. Evelyn was walking with Mrs. Pembroke near the kitchen garden when two men rushed from the trees. One seized the housekeeper. The other grabbed Evelyn from behind, clamping a hand over her mouth before she could scream. She fought instantly, but the man was stronger. Panic narrowed the world into mud, breath, and the cold press of a blade against her ribs. Then Adrian appeared. He came from the stable yard like a storm breaking loose, pistol in one hand, fury carved into every line of him. The man holding Evelyn dragged her backward and pressed the knife to her throat. Let her go, Adrian said. The calm in his voice was more terrifying than a shout would have been. The attacker laughed. Your cousin sends his regards. Evelyn drove her heel down onto the man's foot and threw herself sideways as Adrian fired. The pistol shot sent the knife spinning away, but a second attacker lunged from behind the garden wall with another blade. Evelyn saw it too late. Adrian. He staggered, blood darkening his coat almost instantly. Footmen and grooms came running from every direction, but Evelyn reached him first, dropping to her knees in the mud as he sank with one hand pressed against the wound. You impossible man, she whispered, her voice shaking. You told me to stay inside. I was coming to find you, he said. And in that terrible moment, with blood soaking through her fingers and fear tightening around her heart, Evelyn realized the truth she had been trying not to see. She no longer wanted this marriage only because it protected her. She wanted the man who had become her shelter. Adrian was still conscious when they carried him inside, though Evelyn had no idea how. Blood soaked through her gloves and the front of her dress where she had pressed both hands against his side all the way from the garden to the manor. The house physician was already waiting in the Duke's chambers by the time the footman laid him on the bed, but Adrian caught Evelyn's wrist before she could step away. Don't leave, he said. The words were rough with pain, yet his grip remained stubbornly strong. Evelyn looked down at him, at the bloodless tension in his face, and felt fear tighten in her chest. In a way she could no longer pretend was only gratitude. She had spent days telling herself that this marriage was an accident, that Ashford Manor was only a refuge, and that Adrian Ashford was only the man who had saved her life in a ruined chapel. But a woman did not tremble like this for a stranger. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Only then did he let go. The wound was deep but not fatal. The physician stitched it, bound it, and finally declared that the Duke would live if he obeyed orders for once in his life. By then, night had already fallen over Ashford Manor, and Evelyn was still sitting beside Adrian's bed. In the same blood-stained gown, too exhausted to think of leaving. He woke sometime after midnight. The fire had burned low. Rain tapped softly against the window. Evelyn had been staring into the flames when his voice broke the silence. "You are still here. You sound disappointed." "Only surprised. You have a very irritating habit of nearly dying." "So I've been told." She handed him a glass of water, and he drank. Slowly, watching her over the rim in that same quiet way that always made her feel as though he saw more than she wanted him to. When he lowered the glass, she asked the question that had been burning in her since the garden. Who were those men? But not acting for Vale alone. One of them carried Nathaniel's signet. Adrian was silent for a moment, then leaned back carefully against the pillows. "My father discovered money missing from Ashford accounts shortly before he died. Nathaniel had access to those ledgers. So did my father's solicitor. Before he could confront anyone, he fell from his horse. He survived the fall. It was the fever afterward that killed him. Mercer believes the medicine given to him was altered. Poisoned. Enough to weaken a man already injured." Adrian's jaw tightened. "After his death, I kept searching. Nathaniel found out. My carriage was attacked outside London. When I survived, I let the world believe I had disappeared so I could move unseen and gather proof. Vale wanted influence over Ashford land and a young wife he could control. Your stepfather's debts gave them both an easy bargain. So I was never just the Earl's bride," she said quietly. "I was part of their arrangement." "Yes." Instead, what rose in her chest was anger so sharp it almost steadied her. "Then they made a mistake," she said. A shadow of surprise crossed Adrian's face. "Did they?" "Because I am very tired of men treating me like property. Something deeper and more dangerous than both. You are the first thing in months that has made me fear what my enemies might take," he said quietly. Evelyn's breath caught. The room went still around them. The fire crackled softly. Somewhere far below, a clock struck 1 in the morning. Adrian did not look away. "When you ran into that chapel," he said, "I agreed to marry you because I could see terror in your face and bruises on your wrists, and because I knew if I let you walk back into the night alone, I would hear of your death before the week was over. But somewhere between that chapel and this house, I stopped thinking of you as a woman I had rescued. Adrian. I will still let you go when this is over." His voice dropped. "Flower. But I will not lie to you again by pretending I feel nothing." Evelyn had imagined this moment in restless fragments over the last few days and hated herself every time she did. She had told herself it was impossible, foolish, dangerous. Yet now that it had come, the truth rose too easily to deny. "I married you to escape a monster," she said softly. "Then I discovered you were a duke, a target, and possibly the most infuriating man in England. I told myself that if I survived all this, I would leave before I became foolish enough to care. Whether you lived or died." Her voice trembled once. "That plan failed rather badly." Evelyn stepped closer instead, bent down, and kissed him before she could lose her nerve. It was not a timid kiss. It was the kiss of a woman who had run through storms, married in fear, and nearly lost the man who had become her shelter before she even realized she was leaning on him. Adrian made a low sound in his throat and drew her carefully against him, one hand sliding to the back of her neck as though he had wanted this for days and still could not quite believe he was allowed to have it. When they finally pulled apart, Evelyn rested her forehead briefly against his. "You are still injured," she whispered. "An appalling inconvenience." The next morning, a letter arrived from London. Nathaniel had petitioned to review Adrian's fitness to resume control of Ashford lands. After his disappearance, Earl Vale, meanwhile, was preparing to accuse Adrian publicly of coercing Evelyn into marriage. Together, the accusations would be devastating. Nathaniel would paint Adrian as unstable. Vale would paint Evelyn as a victim. "They want me dragged into public before I have proof," Adrian said grimly, reading the letter from his bed. And if you refuse? Evelyn asked. Nathaniel claims I'm hiding because I can't answer him. Vale claims you're being held prisoner. Then we stop letting them tell the story. Meaning? Make it impossible for them to hide behind gossip. If they want scandal, let them come to Ashford and face it in your own house. That's dangerous. You're beginning to sound like a duchess. That same afternoon, while Adrian was still confined to bed and the household prepared for unwelcome guests, Evelyn went to the late Duke's study in search of anything Nathaniel might have missed. Mr. Hollis had mentioned that Adrian's father kept private papers separate from official estate records, and if Nathaniel had been stealing from Ashford, there was a chance the old Duke had hidden something. She found it in the bottom drawer of an escritoire behind a false panel. Inside lay several letters, a small ledger, and one folded document bearing Earl Vale's seal. Evelyn opened it and felt the blood drain from her face. It was a contract. Vale had agreed to clear a series of debts owed jointly by Evelyn's stepfather and Nathaniel Ashford in exchange for certain domestic arrangements advantageous to both parties, including his marriage to Evelyn Whitmore, and access to one of Ashford's southern hunting properties. For a moment, Evelyn simply stared. She had been used as part of Nathaniel's bargain with Vale. A sound behind her made her spin around. Clara stood in the doorway. For one impossible second, Evelyn thought she was imagining her. Then Clara rushed forward and threw her arms around her. Clara. I escaped this morning when one of Mr. Hollis's men came to the village with the dinner invitation. Clara looked pale and frightened, her bonnet crooked, her gloves torn. What happened? Evelyn asked. Why are you here? Vale was furious that you'd married someone else. He said Nathaniel promised the marriage would go through because once you were in Vale's house, he could use you to get Adrian to sign away Ashford land without realizing why it mattered. Evelyn went cold. There's more, Clara whispered. If the dinner fails, they mean to tell London you were carrying the Duke's child before the wedding and that he married you in secret to hide the scandal. Evelyn almost laughed from sheer disbelief. That is absurd. They only need people to repeat it. Then we make sure London hears something else first. Adrian stood there, pale and very much not in bed, one hand braced against the doorframe. Evelyn marched toward him at once. What are you doing out of bed? Show me. Adrian read it once, then again more slowly. By the end, his expression had become frighteningly calm. Nathaniel used your stepfather's debts to put you in Vale's house, he said. Vale would have gained access to Ashford land through marriage. Nathaniel would have gained money and leverage. And if I returned too soon, his jaw tightened. You would have been a convenient way to control me. What do? We let them come to dinner. That evening, after Clara had been taken upstairs and the house had gone quiet again, Adrian remained in the study while Evelyn re-hid the rest of the papers. You should be in bed, she said without looking at him. And you should be less calm after discovering your attempted marriage was part of a conspiracy. I am furious. Adrian stepped closer, slow and careful because of the wound, and touched her hand. When this ends, he said quietly, I do not want the separation I offered you. I know our marriage began in madness, he went on. I know you had every reason to resent the life you were forced into. But I do not want this house without you in it. That is fortunate. Why? Because I have no intention of leaving it. This time when he kissed her, it was slower, deeper, full of everything both of them had spent days refusing to say. Nathaniel and Earl Vale arrived at Ashford Manor the following evening, dressed for victory. Vale looked exactly as Evelyn remembered, expensive, perfumed, and rotten beneath the velvet. Nathaniel was younger, handsome in the smooth, harmless way that made his cruelty easier to hide. Both entered the dining room expecting a wounded duke, a frightened bride, and an easy performance. Instead, they found Adrian standing at the head of the table in formal black, pale but very much alive, with Evelyn beside him in dark green silk and Clara seated at the far end beneath Mrs. Pembroke's watchful eye. Nathaniel's smile faltered first. Vale recovered more quickly. Your Grace, he drawled, what a relief to see you well enough to receive visitors. London has been so concerned. Dinner lasted barely half an hour before the trap closed. Vale tried to speak of misunderstandings and family. Nathaniel attempted sympathy over Adrian's disappearance. Adrian let them talk. Evelyn let them believe she was merely listening. Then Adrian placed the contract on the table. I think, he said mildly, we have all been pretending long enough. Nathaniel glanced at the document and smiled too quickly. I'm afraid I don't understand. This contract bears your signature and Vale's. It outlines the exchange of Ashford hunting rights and Whitmore debts in return for Lady Evelyn's marriage to Vale. It also confirms that my wife was not the victim of a family arrangement but the subject of a conspiracy involving fraud, coercion, and attempted extortion. Vale surged to his feet. You cannot prove. You said my sister would be useful once she belonged to the Earl. Evelyn rose beside Adrian, every bit as steady as he was. And I am prepared to testify before every magistrate in London that the Earl of Vale pursued marriage through threats and purchased debts. Shall we invite the newspapers as well? You little. Adrian crossed the room in one swift movement, seized Vale by the collar, and slammed him back into his chair. You will not raise your voice at my wife in my house, he said, each word precise with fury. You will sign a confession surrendering every claim against Evelyn Whitmore and you will leave Ashford land before sunrise. If you refuse, this contract and Clara's testimony go to the magistrate before breakfast. Hollis opened the dining room doors and 3 armed men stepped inside. The colour drained from Nathaniel's face. As for you, Adrian said, turning to his cousin, the solicitor has already been summoned. By morning, every account you touched will be audited, every lease reviewed, and every debt exposed. You wanted the title. Instead, you may be fortunate if you keep your freedom. Nathaniel made the mistake of shouting, then insisting that Adrian's father had been weak, that Ashford deserved a stronger heir, that none of this would have happened if the old Duke had simply died sooner. In those furious, careless words, he confessed more than any contract ever could. Vale signed before midnight. Nathaniel was escorted from the house under guard. And when the doors finally shut behind them, the silence that fell over Ashford Manor felt clean for the first time since Evelyn had arrived. Adrian stood in the entrance hall with one hand pressed discreetly to his side, exhaustion beginning to show at the corners of his mouth. You are hurt, Evelyn said at once. I am victorious, he corrected. You are impossible. Clara, watching from the staircase, made a theatrical sound of disgust and fled upstairs before either of them could embarrass her further. The next morning, before dawn had fully broken, Adrian took Evelyn's hand and led her to the carriage waiting in the courtyard. Where are we going? She asked. Pale morning light spilled through the broken stained glass, painting the stone floor gold. Father Alden stood waiting by the altar with a smile he was trying and failing to hide. Adrian turned to Evelyn beneath the same roof where she had once grabbed his sleeve in terror and begged for salvation. The first time you married me, he said, taking both her hands in his, you did it to escape a monster. I accepted because I could not bear to leave you to him. This time I would like to ask you without fear, without lies, and without anyone chasing you through the rain. Adrian drew a breath and for the first time since she had known him, the Duke of Ashford looked almost uncertain. Stay, he said quietly. Not because the law binds you. Not because you need protection. Stay because I love you, because Ashford is home only where you are, and because if you leave now I shall spend the rest of my life resenting every chapel in England. Evelyn laughed through the tears in her eyes. Yes, she whispered. Relief broke across his face so openly that it made her love him all the more. He kissed her beneath the broken stained glass while Father Alden politely pretended not to notice. And for the first time since she had fled Whitmore House, Evelyn felt fear loosen its grip. Months later, London would speak of the scandal of Nathaniel Ashford, the disgrace of Earl Vale, and the miraculous return of the missing Duke. They would speak of the young Duchess who ran from one wedding and accidentally stole a far better one from fate itself. They would not know how often Adrian still looked at Evelyn as though he could not quite believe the desperate girl from the chapel had become the heart of his home. They would not know how Clara delighted in reminding the household that her sister had once proposed marriage to a stranger in wet slippers. They would not know that the most feared man in 3 counties now abandoned estate matters whenever his wife asked him to walk with her through the gardens at sunset. But Ashford Manor knew. It knew in the laughter returning to its halls in the absence of fear and in the way its Duke no longer looked like a man living among ghosts while its Duchess no longer moved like a woman waiting for someone else to decide her fate. And sometimes on quiet evenings when the fire burned low, Adrian would take Evelyn's hand, turn the ring on her finger and murmur with a smile that still belonged more to the garden, the chapel than the Duke in the newspapers, you might have saved us both a great deal of trouble if you had introduced yourself before proposing. To which Evelyn always gave the same answer. If I had known you were a Duke, I might never have been desperate enough to ask. Adrian would draw her closer, kiss her temple, and say the one thing that made all the madness worth it. Then thank God you thought I was poor. If you enjoyed Evelyn and Adrian's story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which moment stole your heart the most.